one of the basic policies of the Muslim states was that they did not have conversion policies. They did not, the Umayyad actually discouraged conversion to Islam. And that is historically documented. They discouraged conversion to Islam. And the way they did it was you had to join an Arabian tribe in order to become a Muslim. You actually had to join a tribe. And that was stopped by Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the fifth rightly guided caliph. He ended that system. It's called the Muwali system. The Abbasids, who were much more tolerant than the Umayyads, and they dropped the total war policy because the Umayyads had a war policy. I mean, they believed in this idea that it's historical destiny, that Islam has to conquer the entire planet. And they basically destroyed their empire in attempting that. It imploded. I mean, they just expanded too quickly, too far, too fast, and it imploded. And the Abbasids, recognizing the fallacy of that argument, adopted a much more tolerant, and this comes also from the Bar Mekkids, who were Afghanis, who came from an extremely tolerant background, who were the dominant ministers, and they had been Buddhist prior to being Muslim. The Bar Mekkid family was a famous priestly family in Afghanistan, and they adopted a much more tolerant position of dealing with conquered peoples. And that goes all the way up to 1258 with the fall, and the Mughals were initially very barbaric but became quite civilized, and they also had extremely tolerant policies. The Ottomans topped them all. The Ottomans did not have a conversion policy. They did not in any way proselytize Islam as a state religion. Really, they did not. It was not policy to proselytize to non-Muslims. They literally left them. They were called milal, and the millet, they left them. They had their own court systems, and this came from the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ was asked by the Jews to judge between them, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you know, كيف يحكمونك وفيهم التوراة وعندهم التوراة فيها حكم الله. How can they come to you and ask you to judge between them, and they have the Torah, and in it is the rule of Allah. So Allah aqarra in the Quran, He actually says that the Jews have their Torah and they should not use the Quran as their source of judgment unless they become Muslim. And for that reason, the Ottomans had courts for the Jews in which the rabbis did their own rulings, and the Christians had their own courts. And the Ottomans did not get involved unless it was penal. In the same way that in this country we have what's called people's courts. If people agree on private arbitration, they can actually do that. And that's a good aspect of this country. Whereas with penal, if you get into outside of civil code and into criminal code, then the state takes its authority. And it was similar in the Ottoman Empire. As long as it was civil, it was left to the millet to decide their own rulings. And that is, according to some researchers, where the West actually got that. Because Henry Stubbs, who was an expert on Ottoman policies of toleration, was contemporaneous with Hobbes, who introduces the idea of, and Henry Stubbs felt that the toleration of the Ottomans, if the Europeans adopted it, it would solve the problem of religious wars. And then from Hobbes you get Locke, who writes the famous treatise on toleration, which becomes the pillar of American freedom of religion, because America has probably the first Freedom of Religious Act, which is from the 17th century in Maryland, is quite radical, although it's very consistent with the Ottoman tradition.
محمد سيد الكونين والثقلين والفريقين من عرب ومن عجم. محمد سيد الكونين والثقلين والفريقين من عرب ومن